There is a moment that almost nobody talks about. A moment that happened not in a boardroom, not in front of a camera, not during some grand announcement, but in the quiet, fluorescent-lit corridors of a Harvard dormitory sometime in the early 1970s. A 19-year-old kid sat alone at a terminal, eyes burning from hours of staring at code, completely consumed by something most people around him couldn't even understand. His roommates were sleeping, the campus was dark, and this young man, who had already been accepted into one of the most prestigious universities on earth, was quietly making a decision that would terrify his parents, baffle his professors, and eventually reshape the entire modern world. He was going to drop out. Not because he was failing, not because he was lost, but because he could see something, clearly, with a kind of almost frightening certainty that almost no one else on the planet could see yet. He could see that computers, those massive, expensive, room-sized machines that only governments and corporations could afford, were about to become personal, were about to become small, were about to land on the desks of ordinary people in ordinary homes, and whoever wrote the software for that future, whoever figured out how to make those machines speak to human beings, would not just become wealthy, they would change civilization itself. That kid was Bill Gates, and the story of how he got to that dormitory, what he did after he left it, the empire he built, the wars he fought, the damage he caused, the billions he gave away, and the complicated, contradictory, deeply human journey behind one of the most famous names in history. That is the story we are going to tell today. Because here is the truth most people miss when they hear the name Bill Gates. They think of a nerdy billionaire. They think of Windows. They think of a man in glasses sitting on enormous piles of money. Some people think of conspiracy theories. Others think of a saint who is saving lives in Africa. But very few people stop to ask the most important question. Who actually is this man? Where did he come from? What drove him? What broke him? What did he sacrifice? And what does his life, all of it, the brilliant parts and the ugly parts, actually mean for the rest of us? Let's go back to the beginning. Not the beginning of Microsoft, the beginning of Bill Gates, the human being. William Henry Gates III was born on October 28, 1955, in Seattle, Washington. The city itself matters. Seattle in the 1950s was not yet the technology hub it would later become. It was a working port city, industrial, gray, frequently rainy, shaped by Boeing and timber and a kind of quiet, hard-working Pacific Northwest ambition. It was not New York. It was not Los Angeles. It was not a place where people expected world historical figures to emerge. And yet, something about that specific environment, its distance from the cultural centers of America, its combination of engineering culture and natural beauty and stubborn independence, produced, within a few decades, companies like Boeing, Amazon, Starbucks, and Microsoft. Seattle has always been a city of builders. Bill Gates was born into that. His family was comfortable, more than comfortable, actually. His father, Bill Gates Sr., was a prominent Seattle attorney, a tall, dignified man who would eventually become one of the most respected civic figures in the Pacific Northwest. His mother, Mary Maxwell Gates, was a force of nature. Sharp, socially connected, deeply ambitious, serving on the board of Unity Way, and eventually on the board of a small regional bank called First Interstate Bank System. She was the kind of woman who walked into a room and immediately understood the power dynamics. She was also the kind of mother who pushed her children relentlessly and lovingly toward excellence. Bill Gates grew up in a household where achievement was not just encouraged, it was expected. The dinner table was a place of debate, of argument, of competing ideas. His father has said in interviews that they played games constantly as a family, board games, card games, trivia games, and that losing was never simply accepted. The family motto, if they had one, might have been something like, "Figure out how to win." Bill Gates absorbed that ethos completely. But he also absorbed something else, something harder to define, a restlessness, an impatience, a sense that there was always a better answer, a faster solution, a smarter way to approach any problem. He was not an easy child. Teachers remember him as brilliant but difficult. He argued with adults. He questioned authority, not out of rebellion, but out of genuine intellectual dissatisfaction. If an adult said something he believed was wrong, he would say so, clearly and persistently, regardless of the social awkwardness it caused. He was socially awkward in general, actually. While other kids were figuring out how to navigate friendships and sports teams and school dances, young Bill Gates was somewhere else entirely, inside his own mind, turning problems over and over, searching for solutions that satisfied him. His parents, to their enormous credit, recognized that their son was unusual. Not just smart, genuinely unusual. And instead of trying to smooth those edges, instead of trying to make him fit the standard mold, they made a decision that would have enormous consequences. They enrolled him in Lakeside School. Lakeside was, and still is, one of Seattle's elite private schools. In the late 1960s, it was an all-boys institution, academically rigorous, filled with the children of Seattle's professional class. And in 1968, through a combination of luck and foresight that is almost impossible to overstate, the Lakeside School Mothers Club used the proceeds from a rummage sale to purchase computer time on a General Electric time-sharing computer. This was 1968. Most American high schools had no computers whatsoever. The idea that teenagers might have access to computing time was, in that era, genuinely extraordinary. Bill Gates was 13 years old, and the moment he sat down at that terminal, something happened to him that he has described in interviews over and over again throughout his life, something he has never been fully able to explain, except to say that it was immediate and it was total. He was captivated, consumed. He understood instinctively that this machine was not just a tool, it was a language, and he wanted to speak it fluently. He began spending every moment he could at that terminal. He skipped meals. He snuck out of his house at night to walk to the school and use the computer. He formed a small group of equally obsessed friends, and together they pushed the boundaries of what they were supposed to be doing, exploring the system, finding its weaknesses, teaching themselves to program in a way that went far beyond anything the school intended. One of those friends was a slightly older boy named Paul Allen. The friendship that formed between Gates and Allen in those hallways would eventually produce one of the most consequential business partnerships in the history of American capitalism. But here is what is important to understand about those early years. This was not a hobby for Bill Gates. It was not a phase. It was the thing, the singular obsession that organized everything else in his life. When he was 15, he and Paul Allen started a small company called TrafoData, a system designed to analyze traffic data for city planners. It actually worked. They made some money. For a teenager, the fact that he had built something that a real institution would pay real money for was intoxicating. It was proof of a hypothesis he was already forming in his mind, that software, code, programs, the logic that made machines do things had value, real value, market value, and that whoever understood how to create and sell that value would have an extraordinary amount of power in the coming world. He went to Harvard in 1973, and by any measure, he should have thrived there. He was intellectually prepared for the academic challenge in a way that most freshmen are not. He tested out of requirements. He sat in on graduate mathematics courses. His mind was, by any serious assessment, operating at a level that impressed even the professors at one of the world's greatest universities. But Harvard, for Bill Gates, was a kind of waiting room. He was there, he was performing, he was present, but his attention was always somewhere else. He was watching the technology industry with the intensity of a hawk watching prey. And then, in December of 1974, Paul Allen walked into a newsstand in Harvard Square and saw the cover of Popular Electronics magazine. On that cover was a picture of a small metal box called the Altair 8800, manufactured by a small company in New Mexico called MITS. The headline called it the world's first mini-computer kit that rivals commercial models. Paul Allen bought the magazine and ran to find Bill Gates, and the two of them looked at that image and understood with absolute clarity, with the kind of certainty that visits certain people at certain moments in history, that this was the moment. The personal computer was here, and there was no software for it, none. And whoever wrote that software first would own the future. Gates called MITS and told them he had a working basic programming language interpreter for the Altair. He did not have one. He had not written a single line of it. He was, in that moment, bluffing with breathtaking confidence. And then he went back to his dorm and wrote it, he and Allen both, in a furious weeks-long sprint of coding that has since become one of the foundational legends of Silicon Valley. They had no actual Altair to test it on. They wrote the whole thing theoretically, simulating the machine in their heads and on paper. When Allen flew to Albuquerque to present it to MITS, it was the first time either of them had run the program on an actual Altair 8800. It worked. That moment, that improbable, audacious, slightly dishonest, completely brilliant moment was the birth of what would become Microsoft. Bill Gates left Harvard in 1975. He never went back to finish his degree. Mary Gates, his mother, was reportedly not pleased. His father worried. His professors thought he was making a catastrophic mistake. And Bill Gates, 20 years old, moved to Albuquerque, New Mexico to start a software company with his best friend. The early years of Microsoft are a story of grinding, unglamorous, almost punishing work. Albuquerque in the mid-1970s was not a romantic place to build a technology empire. Gates and Allen worked in modest conditions, writing code, negotiating deals, trying to convince hardware manufacturers that software was something worth paying for, a concept that was, in that era, genuinely controversial. Many hardware companies believed software should be free. Gates believed the opposite, and he argued for that belief with a ferocity that made him enemies almost from the start. In 1976, he wrote an open letter to the nascent hobbyist computing community that became one of the most controversial documents in the history of the technology industry. He accused hobbyists of stealing software, of copying programs without paying for them, and argued that this made it impossible for software developers to earn a living, and therefore impossible to create good software. The hobbyists were furious. They saw computing as a communal, open enterprise. Gates saw it as a business. That tension between open and closed, between communal and commercial, would define the technology industry for the next 50 years, and it would define the public image of Bill Gates for much of his career. Microsoft moved to the Seattle suburb of Bellevue in 1979, and then, in 1980, the phone call that changed everything. IBM, the most powerful technology company in the world at the time, was building a personal computer. They needed an operating system. They called a small company called Digital Research, whose founder, Gary Kildall, famously, and the details of exactly what happened are disputed to this day, was unavailable for the meeting. IBM called Microsoft instead. Gates did not have an operating system, but he knew where to find one. He purchased a system called QDOS, Quick and Dirty Operating System, from a Seattle programmer named Tim Patterson for $50,000. He licensed it to IBM as PC-DOS, and crucially, this is the move that defines Gates as a businessman more than anything else. He retained the rights to license that same system to other manufacturers. IBM, in its corporate arrogance, did not think to demand exclusivity. Gates, 25 years old, understood exactly what they had missed. He licensed that operating system, now called MS-DOS, to every manufacturer who built an IBM-compatible PC. And as the personal computer revolution exploded in the early 1980s, Microsoft was on every single machine. By 1985, Microsoft was worth hundreds of millions of dollars. By 1990, when Windows 3.0 was released and the graphical interface finally became accessible to ordinary consumers, Microsoft was on its way to becoming the most valuable company in the world. And Bill Gates, not yet 40 years old, was on his way to becoming the richest private individual in human history. But here is what the numbers don't tell you. Here is what the stock prices and the market valuations and the magazine covers don't capture. The internal reality of Microsoft in those years was brutal. Gates was a demanding boss in a way that went beyond high standards into something that many employees found genuinely frightening. He was famous for tearing apart presentations, for sitting in meetings and saying, with complete directness, that someone's work was the stupidest thing he had ever seen, for pushing people past the boundaries of what they believed they were capable of. Former Microsoft employees have described a culture of extreme pressure, of 80 and 90-hour work weeks, of a kind of competitive intensity that consumed personal lives and relationships. Gates himself worked with an almost pathological dedication. He has acknowledged in later life that he did not take vacations for most of his 20s, that he did not believe in weekends, that work was not something he did, it was something he was. His personal life reflected this. He was famously awkward in social situations, famously difficult to be close to, famously consumed by his work to the exclusion of almost everything else. He dated occasionally, but remained essentially married to Microsoft for the better part of 2 decades. And then, in 1987, at a trade show, he met a young Microsoft employee named Melinda French. She was smart and strong-willed and capable of standing up to him in a way that few people in his life had ever done. They began a relationship that would take years to develop. Gates was not, by his own admission, a natural romantic, and eventually married in 1994 on the Hawaiian island of Lanai, which Gates rented entirely for the wedding. Professionally, the 1990s brought Microsoft to the absolute summit of corporate power. Windows 95 became a cultural phenomenon. Its launch was treated like the opening of a blockbuster film, with Paul McCartney's Start Me Up playing as the operating system booted for the first time in public. Microsoft Office dominated business computing. Internet Explorer won the browser wars through a combination of strategy, leverage, and tactics that would eventually land the company in the most significant antitrust trial in American history since the breakup of Standard Oil. The Department of Justice sued Microsoft in 1998. The government's case was that Microsoft had used its monopoly power over computer operating systems to crush competition, specifically Netscape's browser, by bundling Internet Explorer with Windows and pressuring hardware manufacturers to install it exclusively. The trial was public, and it was damaging. Gates's deposition, in which he appeared evasive, combative, and oddly ignorant of basic facts about his own company, became notorious. Judge Thomas Penfield Jackson ultimately ruled that Microsoft had violated antitrust law and ordered the company broken up. The ruling was later overturned on appeal, and the Bush administration settled the case with relatively modest restrictions. But the trial had done something that no business rival had ever managed to do. It had made Bill Gates look, to the general public, not like a visionary, but like a monopolist who had used his power to crush smaller competitors rather than to innovate. It was the low point of his public reputation, and it coincided, perhaps not entirely coincidentally, with a period of genuine personal reflection. In 2000, Bill Gates stepped down as CEO of Microsoft. Steve Ballmer, his longtime friend and colleague, took over day-to-day operations. Gates became chairman and remained deeply involved, but the center of gravity in his life began, slowly and then with gathering speed, to shift. He and Melinda had been talking for years about what they owed the world, about what responsibility came with the kind of wealth they had accumulated, about whether a man who had more money than he could ever spend had some obligation to use it for something beyond building a bigger house. The answer they arrived at was the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, established in 2000 with an initial endowment of around $28 billion. It would eventually grow, especially after Warren Buffett pledged most of his own fortune to the foundation in 2006, into the largest private charitable foundation in human history. And the work it chose to do was not the safe, reputationally comfortable philanthropy of building libraries or endowing universities. Gates and Melinda chose to go after the diseases and problems that the world had, in a sense, given up on. Polio, malaria, tuberculosis, the diseases of poverty, the diseases that killed millions of children in the developing world every year, diseases that received almost no research funding because the people who suffered from them could not afford to pay for drugs. The approach Gates brought to global health was the same approach he had brought to software: intense, data-driven, impatient with conventional wisdom, and willing to make large bets on unconventional solutions. He studied epidemiology with the same focus he had once brought to learning basic. He hired world-class scientists and public health experts. He funded vaccine distribution programs that reached hundreds of millions of children in countries that had essentially no functioning health infrastructure. He pushed, personally and financially, on malaria research at a time when the disease had been essentially abandoned by the pharmaceutical industry because there was no profitable market for a malaria vaccine. He partnered with governments, with the World Health Organization, with local organizations in Africa and South Asia, in ways that were sometimes clumsy and sometimes arrogant and sometimes genuinely transformative. The results are measurable. The number of children dying from vaccine-preventable diseases has fallen dramatically over the period that the Gates Foundation has been active. Polio, which once paralyzed hundreds of thousands of children every year, has been pushed to the edge of eradication. It now exists in only a tiny handful of locations in the world, down from more than 100 countries when Gates began funding the eradication campaign. Malaria deaths have fallen significantly. Maternal mortality in parts of sub-Saharan Africa has declined. These are not small achievements. These are, by any serious measure, among the most significant public health accomplishments of the early 21st century. And yet, the criticisms are real, and they deserve to be heard. Critics from across the political spectrum have raised serious and substantive concerns about the Gates Foundation's model of philanthropy. Some argue that Gates, by virtue of the sheer scale of his foundation's resources, wields an extraordinary and entirely unaccountable influence over global public health policy, that he effectively sets the agenda for organizations like the WHO, that recipient governments adjust their health priorities to match foundation funding priorities, that the voice of a single private citizen, however well-intentioned, has no business shaping the public health policy of sovereign nations. Others have pointed out that some of the Foundation's agricultural initiatives in Africa, which promoted the adoption of Western-style commercial farming practices, were implemented without sufficient consultation with local farmers and communities and produced mixed results at best. And then there are the criticisms that are more personal. The Gates marriage, which had seemed to many observers like a genuine and stable partnership, ended in divorce in 2021 after 27 years. Melinda Gates, in the years following the announcement, gave interviews that suggested significant personal difficulties in the marriage that went back many years. She has referenced, obliquely but clearly, pain and struggles within the relationship that she described as unworkable. The details remain largely private, but the divorce and the questions it raised about the private man behind the public philanthropist added a layer of complexity to the Gates story that his public relations apparatus could not smooth away. There were also reports of his continued association after the latter's criminal convictions with the financier Jeffrey Epstein. Gates has acknowledged that he met with Epstein on multiple occasions and has said he regrets those meetings. The full nature of that relationship remains a source of ongoing questions. All of this matters, not to diminish the genuine good the Gates Foundation has done, but because it is part of the complete picture. Bill Gates has spent much of the last 2 decades trying to transform his public image from monopolist to humanitarian. And the transformation is real, not simply a PR exercise. But the man is not a saint. He has made enormous mistakes, personal and professional. He has wielded power in ways that were sometimes thoughtful and sometimes reckless. He has been brilliant and visionary, and also arrogant and occasionally cruel. He is, in other words, a human being, which should not need saying, but somehow, with figures of this magnitude, always does. There is a quality that Bill Gates possesses that very few people in history have possessed to the same degree, and it is worth pausing on because it is, in the end, probably the most important thing about him. It is the quality of sustained, disciplined intellectual curiosity. His famous Think Weeks, twice-yearly retreats to a small cabin in the woods of the Pacific Northwest, where he goes entirely alone with a stack of books and papers and emerges days later, having synthesized an enormous amount of information and formed new views, have become the stuff of business legend. But they are not a quirk. They are an expression of something fundamental in his character. The belief that understanding the world requires sustained attention, that good decisions require genuine knowledge, and that the work of learning is never finished. He has written extensively about climate change, about pandemic preparedness. His 2015 TED Talk warned with remarkable specificity about the danger of a global pandemic originating from a respiratory virus years before COVID-19. About energy, about artificial intelligence, about the future of food. Not all of his views are correct, not all of his proposed solutions have worked, but the intellectual seriousness is genuine, and it is rare. Most billionaires, having made their fortunes, spend their remaining years in comfortable self-congratulation. Gates, for all his flaws, has spent his in genuine engagement with the hardest problems in the world. Consider what he has actually given away. At the time of this writing, Bill Gates and the Gates Foundation have distributed more than $60 billion in grants. This is not a rounding error. This is not a tax strategy. This is a genuine transfer of private wealth toward public goods on a scale that has no real historical precedent. Warren Buffett, the second wealthiest person in American history for much of his life, looked at the Gates Foundation's work and decided to give essentially his entire fortune to it, the greatest single act of charitable giving in the history of capitalism, because he concluded that no other institution in the world was better positioned to turn money into lives saved. And lives have been saved, millions of them. Children who are alive today in Nigeria, in India, in Bangladesh, in Ethiopia, who would have died from measles or polio or malaria or a complication of childbirth if the Gates Foundation had not existed, are alive. They are walking to school. They are playing. They are growing up. They do not know the name Bill Gates. They never will. And that, in its way, is perhaps the most meaningful thing you can say about this chapter of his life. But let us return, as we must, to the full sweep of the story. Because the temptation with someone like Bill Gates is to resolve the contradictions too neatly, to say, in essence, that he did bad things in his business career and good things with his philanthropy, and they somehow cancel each other out. That is not the lesson. The lesson is more uncomfortable and more interesting than that. What Bill Gates's life actually illustrates is the relationship between exceptional capability and the systems, legal, moral, social, that are supposed to govern how that capability is used. Gates, at the height of Microsoft's power, operated in a world where antitrust enforcement was weak and the technology industry was largely self-regulated. He took advantage of that environment with brilliant and ruthless effectiveness. When the legal system finally caught up with him, it found him to have violated the law. When public pressure caught up with him, it found him using his foundation's power in ways that concentrated influence in the hands of a single private actor. These are not small things. They matter. They tell us something important about what happens when exceptional individuals operate without adequate accountability.
And yet, and this is the part that is genuinely hard to sit with, the same qualities that made him a ruthless monopolist also made him the most effective philanthropist in history. The same impatience with conventional wisdom that made him dangerous to his business competitors made him willing to fund malaria research when no one else would. The same obsessive attention to data and outcomes that he applied to Microsoft's market share, he now applies to child mortality rates. You cannot fully separate the hero from the villain here, because they are the same person, driven by the same engine. He is 68 years old as this is written. He is no longer married. He has 3 children, Jennifer, Rory, and Phoebe, with whom he appears to have warm and genuine relationships. He has said that he intends to give away essentially all of his remaining wealth before he dies, and has signed the Giving Pledge, a commitment by the world's wealthiest individuals to give away the majority of their fortunes, along with more than 200 other billionaires. He reads voraciously. He still does his think weeks. He remains engaged with the foundation, with climate change, with pandemic preparedness. He does not appear to be winding down. He appears, if anything, to be in a hurry. There is a moment Gates has described in interviews that keeps coming back when you think about the arc of his life. It was in Africa, visiting programs the foundation had funded. He was standing in a health clinic in a small village, the kind of place that before the foundation's work had essentially no access to basic vaccines. And he watched as a health worker administered a vaccine to a small child, a child who had traveled miles to reach the clinic, and the child cried because the needle hurt, and the mother held the child and said something gentle, and the child stopped crying and looked around with wide eyes. And Gates said quietly that in that moment he understood something that all the software code and all the market share and all the stock valuations had never quite given him: the feeling of a life changed, a life that would continue because of a decision made in a boardroom in Seattle 30 years earlier, a life that would go forward, a life saved. That is the thing to hold on to. Not the antitrust verdict, not the deposition, not the conspiracy theories, not even the philanthropy viewed abstractly as a strategy or a legacy project, but that child in a clinic in Africa, crying because a needle hurt, held by a mother, and then looking around at the world with wide and living eyes.
Bill Gates is not a simple story. He was never going to be. He came from a privileged family and built something extraordinary, and he used that extraordinary thing to crush competitors and extract wealth in ways that the law ultimately found unacceptable. And then he turned around and used that wealth to save lives at a scale that has almost no precedent in human history. And his personal life has been complicated and painful in ways that his money could not resolve. And he has been wrong about important things and right about important things. And he carries the weight of all of it, visibly, in the way he talks, in the way he thinks, and the way he seems still to be in a genuine and sometimes desperate hurry to do more. The question his life asks us is not whether he is a good man or a bad man. That question is too simple for someone this complex. The question his life asks us is, what do we owe each other? What does success create as an obligation? When someone has taken more from the world, more market share, more power than any single person arguably should, what does repayment look like? Is it possible? Is $60 billion enough? Is it the right $60 billion? Who decides? These are not comfortable questions. They are not meant to be. They are the questions that the life of William Henry Gates III, the boy who snuck out of his house at night to sit at a computer terminal, the young man who bluffed his way into a deal that changed the world, the businessman who played to win in ways that sometimes crossed the line, the philanthropist who turned his fortune toward the most invisible suffering on earth, leaves behind for all of us to wrestle with. And maybe that is the most honest thing you can say about legacy. Not that Bill Gates solved the great problems of our time. He didn't. Not that he was a perfect man. He wasn't. But that he refused, from the age of 13 in a Seattle school to the age of 68 wherever he sits reading this evening, to look away from hard problems. That he kept showing up. That he kept asking what more could be done. That the engine that started in that dormitory hallway, restless, relentless, impossibly ambitious, never really stopped running. The world is full of people with great intelligence. It is full of people with great wealth. It is full of people with great power. What is rare, what has always been rare, is the person who looks at all of that and asks, what is it for? That question, asked seriously, without a comfortable answer waiting on the other side, is the question Bill Gates has been living inside of for the better part of his life. And the asking of it, imperfect and incomplete and ongoing as it is, may be the most important thing he has ever done.